Hello and welcome to Aquarelle. Here is just a quick little preview of what I'm going to be demonstrating for you today. I love painting birds and I painted that little illustration of the Cardinals yesterday, so it kind of just inspired me to paint some more realistic birds because I really enjoy painting that way sometimes. And I was just looking at so many pictures of Cardinals online trying to get inspired for that illustration project, and I just couldn't resist. So there is a template. It's going to be below. It is free for you on my Gumroad page, so feel free to use that to get the drawing out of the way. I give those to you because I know that a lot of people just want to paint. They don't necessarily have a big interest in trying to figure out the mechanics of drawing things. So that's what it's there for. It's a resource for you so that you can get a quick start on the actual painting process. So let's talk a little about color. Before I get started on this tutorial, I just want to go into a little bit of detail on my colors. So I have my regular porcelain palette here, and I've mentioned this before, but right now what I'm trying to do is actually use up as much of these colors as I can, because going forward what I want to do is only have the colors on my palette that I'm actually using for the demonstration. And because I don't like wasting anything, I'm just trying to use all of this up. And as I go along, that means I will run out of some colors that are really necessary. So I'm going to be supplementing this palette with this palette. And this is actually the very first watercolor palette I ever owned, and I actually really like it. It's plastic, so definitely doesn't have the nice feel of porcelain, but it's still a really nice palette, and it was only like $6 or $7. And what I really like about it too is that you can put your thumb in it, so if you're outside painting, it's really convenient. And there's a lot of mixing area here, but basically I'm going to need to supplement this palette with some colors from here just because I'm out of them on this palette. So let's talk about what I'm going to be using. Most of the colors I need are still on this palette. I have a warm yellow. Mine is called New Gamboge. It's by Daniel Smith, but any warm yellow will do. This is Windsor Lemon by Winsor & Newton. This is Scarlet Lake by Daniel Smith. And as always, I apologize for any background noise. This is why I typically just do a voiceover for the entire video, but it's easier right now just to do it this way, and my dogs are kind of crazy, so I'm sorry about that. Hazel, lay down. Oh, okay. So this is Hematite Genuine. This is by Daniel Smith, and it comes in the Daniel Smith Prima Tech line. And I have Cobalt Blue right here. This is by Winsor & Newton, I believe. And this is kind of a medium blue, so it's kind of in the middle of like a warm blue and a cool blue. And then on this palette, I mostly will need, hold on one second. Hazel? No. I will just hold on to Hazel while I finish this up, I guess. Okay, so on this one, all I'm really going to need is my cool red, like my magenta. So my permanent rose I'll be using. And then I also have some more ultramarine blue on this palette. That is my coolest blue. I won't need any warm blue for this painting that I'm going to do today, so this should be good enough. So yeah, I just wanted to give you a quick overview. Oh, and by the way, the permanent rose and the ultramarine blue, both by Winsor & Newton, although there's many great watercolor brands out there. This is just what I happen to be using. And as always, there's a link in the description to an Amazon list that has all of my watercolor painting supplies and paints that I use. And I don't necessarily think that you need to use Amazon to buy things. I think that you should price compare between like Amazon and other art retailers. I like Jerry's Artarama, and sometimes they do have better prices, but the Amazon lists are just really easy to use. So I feel like that is just kind of helpful to give you an idea of some of the things that I use. All right, so now let's get down to painting. Okay, so now we can get down to the actual painting process. So I'm just going to kind of set these aside for now because I first need to do my drawing. And this is going to be a drawing of two cardinals, a male and a female. And I do want this painting to be more on the realistic side. I'm using just some copy paper from my printer to do the sketch. And once I have the sketch done, I will use that to transfer it onto my watercolor paper. And I like to use transfer paper, also known as carbon paper. If you've seen my other videos, you're very familiar with that. I like it because if I'm kind of doing a sketch like this where I want it to be pretty precise and realistic, I don't want to do a lot of scratching and erasing all over my actual watercolor paper. So I like to do all the rough work on some cheap copy paper. And then once I have that pretty well refined, then I can just transfer the correct lines onto my watercolor paper and I don't have to do any erasing or guesswork or anything. So I'm going to speed up the drawing process, just kind of putting these birds into place. This is just kind of my way of drawing. It's a lot of trial and error, I guess, because things do not always go the way that you want, but you know, drawing's like anything else. The more you do it, the better you get at it. And actually, I really like drawing. I was just one of those kids where you could give me a pencil and a ream of paper and I would have it filled up in no time. My parents used to bring home reams of paper from their jobs, and I just had a little desk in the corner of our dining room and I would just sit there and draw for hours, and it was heaven, and it still is. And I have so much of a drawing background that actually starting to work with color was always a really big challenge for me, and I think that it still is. I've studied a lot of color theory, but I still really struggle with it, although I'm so intrigued by it that, you know, that has kind of fueled me to keep exploring color and paint. It's just very different from drawing. I think when you do a lot of drawing, you're used to just having a lot of control. And especially with watercolor, it's really about letting go of that. So now I've got my drawing and I'm using my transfer paper here on my watercolor paper and just using some pressure to make the lines transfer to my watercolor paper. And I'm checking it, seeing, you know, if I've missed any lines or if lines are at least dark enough that I can see them. I obviously don't want the lines to be super dark, but I also don't want them to be so light that they're barely perceptible. For a lot of the birds, especially in the areas where there's some feathers that are a little bit fluffier, I use broken lines. So you might see some broken lines on the template, and I don't necessarily think that you need to do the transfer exactly the way that I draw it. Just do what you're comfortable with. But I do use broken lines just to give that sense of softness in some areas where I think that that's going to be really important. This first color that I'm mixing is going to be kind of the base layer for the female, so it needs to be kind of a neutral brown. I'm using my warm yellow and my cool red, and I will refer to them as the primary color that they are and then whether or not they're warm or cool, because I think that translates a little bit better to other brands that people might be using that have different names. So my warm yellow, my cool red, and then my cool blue, just to neutralize this a little bit. And I think one important thing that I've learned about color is that trying to mix the exact precise color that you see in a photograph is not really something that you should pursue too much or put too much emphasis on that, because it's just going to make the painting process tedious and unenjoyable. And so I think when I look at a photo, I try to just judge the photo as, you know, what essentially is this color? Is it, you know, a neutral color, which most of the time it is? Is it a warm neutral? Is it a cool neutral? And I kind of go from there. So I think in terms of how neutral or how vibrant the color is, And then I think about the temperature. So if it leans closer to the cool side of the spectrum or the warmer side. So this was definitely a warm neutral. So that's why it has a lot of yellow and red and just a little bit of blue just to tone it down a little bit. So I'm going to use this color just to form the base layer for the female cardinal that I can build up from. So I want to keep this fairly light, but this is really going to be the only stage in this painting where I do a wash or a wet into wet technique at all. A lot of this painting is going to be dry brush. So if you're not familiar with the technique of dry brush, I did make a very short video on different ways to do dry brush, and I talked a little bit about where it's useful. So you might want to check that out. So now I've shifted that neutral a little bit more toward the yellow side, still trying to keep this very light. And I'm looking at my photo reference, which I will also include the photo reference that I am using down below. And I get my photo references from a website called pixabay.com, and it's a great resource for artists because it is a bunch of photographers submitting their work, and they make their work available for anyone to use for free and without any kind of copyright. So you'll notice that the photo references are a little bit different than what I'm actually painting. So I'm using the photo references for color, but I've actually positioned the birds a little bit differently because I just wanted to have two birds in the same scene together, kind of just sitting together, because I really wanted that contrast of the male and female cardinal. Okay, so now I've put a little bit of my permanent rose into that neutral brown color, and I'm going to just let this kind of gently merge into the other neutrals around it. And for the female, we don't really want any bright red, so that's why I added that permanent rose into that other neutral color so that it wouldn't be too vibrant or bright. And so I'm just going to apply that to kind of the tip of the wing area and then the entire tail. And now I'm just adding a little bit more permanent rose to that same mix, getting it just a little bit more vibrant. And I also added some of my Scarlet Lake, which is my warmer red. So my cool red and my warm red here. And I'm just going to start adding a little bit of definition. Now keep in mind that where I have already been working is still pretty damp. So I will get some soft edges, just a little bit of merging between these brighter colors and then the more subtle colors. And on the female cardinal, you'll notice that there are just very small marks that are a little bit more vibrant. So now I'm adding in my cool blue, and you can see that this is basically at this point a violet, but I'm going to add in some of my warm yellow, and now we got a more neutral color. This is kind of a neutral violet, and I'm also going to use this to start adding in some definition where I can see a little bit of separation between the feathers. Now, even though I am going for a more realistic look, I'm not here to paint every feather in detail and to scientific accuracy or anything like that. So basically, when I'm looking at my photo reference, I'm looking for points of contrast more so than I am looking for individual feathers. And I think that that's a really important distinguishment to make, because if you get into the mode of zooming in on your photo reference and noticing where every single feather is, you run the risk of kind of over-rendering every single feather. So you're going to end up putting more contrast in areas that really don't need it. So it's completely okay to have some feathers that you can see in the photo reference that you're not really addressing at all in your painting. If nothing else, that's really for the sake of realism, because I think a pitfall with realism is that especially we are working from a photo reference and it's a really high resolution photo reference, we can see every little detail in there. But unless you have just really supreme control over your values and your color, I think it's best to leave those areas with less contrast alone and just focus on the areas with a little bit more contrast. Over the last maybe year or so, I've been really studying Impressionism. And one big takeaway that I have gotten from that is that we really need to use implication in our painting a lot more. We don't need to articulate every little thing that our eyes can discern. We need to leave a lot of it just kind of up to the perception of the viewer. We need to invite the viewer to come into the painting and allow them to engage with it. And that means not articulating every little thing, allowing a lot to be just implied. And so I really try to practice that in my watercolor painting as well as my oil painting. And areas where I like to use it are, if there's no contrast, then I kind of will just ignore it and I'll just let the color and the paint mingle and do what it will and just kind of leave that to chance a little bit. Or if I have an edge that is very dark and then the background is very dark, I won't even articulate that edge necessarily. I will just let that edge be lost. And you may have heard that term, lost edges. And so I think we need to do more of that in our painting because that will help us at once achieve more realism and also achieve a certain looseness that I think that we're always after. Okay, so now I'm going to do a little bit of dry brushing here on the underbelly. I'm using more of that warm neutral color. And I have my paper towel over to the side and you'll see me just kind of constantly blotting my brush onto that paper towel to remove any excess water. So if I put a dry brush stroke down and I feel like it is too dark or there's too much contrast, what I'm going to do is try to lighten it up just by blotting out more of the water and even some of the pigment onto my paper towel so that I get a more subtle stroke. Now I'm adding my ultramarine blue, or otherwise known as my cool blue, into that neutral mix. So it's still very neutral, but now it's a little bit cooler in temperature. And blotting that off on my paper towel so I can get some dry brush effects. And every time I do this, I'll make a little mark on my painting and just kind of judge if that is kind of feeling right for where I'm putting it. And if it's not, then I'm going to adjust it. And here I'm just going to give the impression again of the separation between these feathers that are a little bit more prominent, where there is a little bit more contrast in the photo reference. And I'm using a very light touch, and you'll see that my strokes are, I'm not necessarily drawing, I'm kind of using that light touch, but I am being very decisive in my stroke. And I'm kind of creating a little bit of form with this color. So adding just a little bit of definition where I see it. A little bit of modeling. And even a little bit, maybe a touch of shadow. There isn't a lot of shadow on these birds. But anytime that we have a three-dimensional form, we're going to get a little bit of a shadow just kind of showing the form. And I'm trying to keep these strokes very subtle, so you may not see a big difference from this vantage point. And that's actually really important, because if you're doing dry brush and you're just kind of getting started going over your initial wet and wet or washes, you want to build these up gradually. You don't want to go in with, a really dark or a really vibrant color, because it won't look natural. So you want to build these up as though you're kind of building up your values gradually. And I'm also using the dry brush not only just to find the separation between feathers and a little bit of form, but also to create that little bit of soft texture that I'm seeing. So again, I'm not looking to paint every little bit of texture that I see in the photograph. I'm just using the brush in a general way to help create that impression of texture. And a lot of times when I mix, it's really a very intuitive process for me. It's also very experimental. So I might mix a color and it won't be quite right. And so I'm just going to adjust it a little bit. But again, I don't think that we need to get too caught up in mixing precise colors, because we would just spend all of our time doing that and we would lose the spontaneity of this medium, which I think is really important, even when you're doing a more realistic painting. So I have this very, very cool neutral. And again, I'm just using this to lightly dry brush a little bit of definition down here at the tip of the feathers on the wing and the tail. And using very short dry brush strokes to create just a little bit of texture. I'm starting to notice the different sections of the wing. There's not a lot of contrast there. It's kind of just a little bit of form that I want to bring into that area. And keep in mind too that at this point, this bird may not be wet, but is still damp. So everything I'm putting down right now, even though I'm using dry brush, I'm getting a lot of soft edges. And at some point, I'm going to have to just move on to the other bird and let this dry a little bit more thoroughly, because there are going to be some very, very small areas that I do need a little bit more of a hard edge, and areas that I'm going to want to add a little bit more brightness to. And so I don't want those things to kind of soak in to this damp paint that's on here right now. Now I'm using this cool neutral just to add a little bit of definition to the beak, but I'm not going to paint the beak on this bird just yet. I'll wait until I'm ready to do the beak on the other bird, and then I'll just be able to use the same color for each. And I'm also using this cool neutral to start putting in the form of the legs. And this is something I do a lot, whether I'm doing a more realistic watercolor painting or one of my illustrations. I'm not concerned with matching all the colors that I see in the photograph. What I'm going to do a lot of is I'll have one color, for example, in this case, it's my very cool neutral, and I'm going to start using that to create a lot of the shadows or, more defined areas. So I'll have kind of one go-to color that I designate as kind of like my shadow color or my defining color. And I'll use that throughout the painting, because I feel like, first of all, it's convenient. I don't have to, for every single part of these birds, come up with a different color to do the shadows. But I think it also brings a little more sense of cohesion to the overall colors of the painting. Okay, so I've moved on to the male cardinal now, and I am starting out basically with orange. So I've used my warm yellow and my cool red, because even though this cardinal is ultimately going to have the overall feeling of being red, I have noticed in the photo a lot of just kind of warm undertones in this bird. So there's going to be some areas where the bird is getting a lot of light, and in those areas I'm seeing a lot of really nice warm reds. So I'm just going to go over the entire bird with this, even the eye. I could have actually gone over the eye on the female bird with the colors around it as well, because since in watercolor we work from our lighter values up to our darker values, I could easily just go over that with a little bit of my darkest color. There is a little bit of reflection in the eyes that I want to capture as best I can, but at this point I'm really not worried about that because it's so small and it's really, it's not even like a secondary concern. My primary concern and what I'm really most focused on is the texture of these birds and the coloration, because that is what I find most intriguing. And I think it's good to think about what it is that you want to get out of doing any given painting. What is it that inspired you to do the painting in the first place? So now I'm going over this orange color with some of my cool red using a dry brush technique. However, of course, because I just put in that wash of the orange, that's all still very wet. So I'm not going to get any like hatch lines here. It's going to be a very subtle effect. And I'm basically just looking for areas on the bird that are more, stereotypically red in color. And I don't want to obliterate the oranges because of course I put that down for a reason, and there's going to be some areas where I want that orange to really show through. And you do need to be a little bit careful when you are doing any kind of dry brush over a wash. I didn't use a lot of water in that wash. If I had, and then I went over that with these dry brush strokes, the dryness of the bristles might actually start to pick up the pigment from that wash. And Permanent Rose is a very beautiful color. It's kind of a magenta color. And I am talking again about my cool red. I keep reverting to using their actual like brand names. But cool reds tend to be more transparent. And even though all watercolors are transparent to some degree, some colors are more transparent than others. And I have found that the cool reds, no matter what brand I'm using, if it's a cool red so it leans a little more toward magenta, those tend to be very transparent. So it's difficult to get a really strong effect when you're using that to glaze over other colors. And then warm reds tend to be a little bit more opaque, so you can get a stronger effect when you apply those over other colors. And so you just need to, again, it's important to get to know your colors and the properties of them so that you can use them appropriately. I don't very often use any kind of warm red to glaze on top of other colors. And that is why I will typically, like for example on this bird, I started out with a warmer kind of orangish red. So that can be the undertone. So now I'm mixing a little bit of my warm red in with my cool red. That gives us a little bit of a neutral. And just kind of testing the waters here on the female bird, kind of seeing how dry it is and adding some dry brush strokes of this more vibrant red to very, very small and select areas on the wing. because again, the female cardinals, they do have a little bit of that red coloration in them, but it is more subtle. So I don't want her to, have colors that compete with the male's colors. And now I'm just glazing over some of these areas with a little bit of my warm yellow, just to add a little bit more of a sunlight effect on those areas that are getting a lot of light. And then I can also use this to start painting that beak. The beaks are a little bit different between the male and female on the photo references that I'm using. So, I think in that circumstance, you could just paint them the same, because the differences in the beaks that I'm looking at might be accounted for just, because they're separate photos, so there's different lighting. But I am just going to keep her beak a little bit lighter than his. His beak is almost just as red as he is. So now I'm using very, very light, cool red to add just a little bit of color to her leg there. And trying to add just a little bit of that red into her wing in a very subtle way. Getting a lot more of that cool red, going for a really strong color here, and then adding my cool blue. So we have a really nice violet. And I want this to be very, very dry. So I blotted a lot of that off into my paper towel. And I'm using a very light stroke. And you can see it's a very quick stroke because I'm really just going for texture here. Again, I'm using this color to add a little bit of definition and to start building up this sense of form in the male cardinal. But I don't want this to be a very dramatic effect. And even on this area around the eye that will ultimately appear just nearly black, I'm using this lighter color. It's a dark color compared to all the colors that I've been using so far, but in the context of the actual finished bird, this is actually a light color, and then I will go over that with dark color, allowing some of this light color to show through, because that will create a more natural look. If I just did that area with a very dark color, it would look a little bit flat and two-dimensional. So I like to have a little bit of room to allow lighter colors to show through, even in the darkest areas. And we don't see a lot of his wing. We only see a few defined feathers. So I'm just going to start building those up very gradually. And then also on the underside, keeping in mind that most of the light is hitting this bird just right at his breast area. So that's where I want to maintain a lot of the oranges and warm reds. And then his tail is a little bit darker. But again, I don't want to just go in with a bunch of dark color because that will make that area look flat and unnatural. So I'm going to build up the darks. And I'm looking for areas that should be a little bit defined. So where his tail feathers kind of meet the bottom part of his body, there's just a little bit of separation there. And the separation is created mostly by texture. So the texture of the feathers is just a little bit different than the texture of the body. The body has kind of those very short, almost fuzzy feathers all over it. And then obviously on the wing, or I'm sorry, the tail, but you know, also the wing, we have those really large feathers. And now I'm going in with a little bit more saturation on these areas that I'm trying to define and build up. And as I move to colors and mixes that are more saturated or darker, you'll find that I am using those a little bit more sparingly. So when I'm starting just to build up the values, I can apply those strokes a little bit more liberally all over the bird because they're very subtle, because there's not a big difference in the value between the dry brush color that I'm applying and then that base color. But as I build that up and everything gets darker, then I'm going to only apply those really dark or vibrant colors to the very, very few areas that actually call for them. And I need to start defining his two legs. But apparently I'm going to just continue adding dry brush strokes to his body. I'll get to his legs eventually. And again, even though the tail is darker, it's not receiving as much light, I don't want to completely obliterate those brighter oranges that I had laid in initially. I want those to show through, even if it's very, very small and subtle, because that just really lends itself to the natural look. Okay, so now I'm finally getting around to his legs. I'm using that same kind of muted violet to just kind of lightly define where those are. The legs really don't have any kind of strong specific color. They're very neutral. They're also fairly light in value, except where there's a little bit of texture and shadow. So I'll just kind of keep it very nondescript on the legs. So now I'm adding a lot of my cool blue into that warm neutral color. And again, I'm looking for areas that need just a little bit more definition. So areas where the feathers are a little bit more separate and maybe have just a hint of shadow between them. And even though right now I'm using a very strong blue, I'm using it in a way that's very, very reserved. So there's only just a few small areas where I will apply even just a hint of this blue. And because these birds are so warm in color overall, they're very, red and orange and warm neutral. So adding a few very subtle hints of this blue will really lend itself to creating a little more contrast in areas where I really need it. And then the same on the male bird. I will use this blue to start darkening this area around his eye. This isn't the darkest color that I will apply here. And again, I really just want to build up these colors and values so that we get that nice layered effect. That's really important anytime that you're painting feathers or fur. You want to gradually build up the colors and the values. It gives a better sense of you know, there being some dimensionality to the layers of fur or feathers. And I think that these are coming along pretty nicely. We're fairly close to being done, actually. You know, a lot of the techniques used to do realism are actually very simple techniques. Basically, I start with a wash. I determine what I want the base color to be, and then I use a lot of dry brush on top of that to create the textures and the very subtle shifts in value and tone and temperature. There's a lot of different ways to use watercolor, which is something that I really appreciate about this medium. You can either be really loose and watery with it, and you can also work in a more controlled way. And for me, it kind of just depends on my mood. What I really like about doing more realistic paintings is that it really just kind of captivates my mind for that time period. It's sort of like working on a puzzle. So if you're someone who likes to do puzzles, I think that this is really the kind of thing that you could probably get into, because with puzzles, you're kind of working piece by piece, and you might work on one area for a while and then move to another area. But in the end, the result is kind of bigger than every small little action that you took to get there. And that's kind of how I see this process. It's a lot of very small actions, and the cumulative effect is, you know, kind of fascinating. So I am using a very, very light dry brush of this blue. I've added a lot of water. And this is really important because I noticed in the wing on the female bird that there is, although these are all neutral colors, there is kind of a distinguishment between the color temperature of the neutral area on her wing and then that neutral warm color on her head and breast area. So I realized that I needed to bring that temperature down a little bit. I needed to cool that temperature down. So just adding a few very, very light dry brush strokes of a very, what do I want to say? So it's not really like a dark or saturated blue. There's not a lot of pigment. I guess that's what I'm trying to say is that it's kind of a diluted pigment, but it's still a dry brush technique because I've removed the excess water by blotting the brush off into my paper towel. And then I was able to use that just to cool down the temperature in just that one part of her wing while still letting those warm undertones show through. And again, I'm just using this color to further add some distinction in the feathers. And you can see I'm kind of using a flicking motion. That way I get a really nice tapered edge or end to the stroke rather than it being all one width. And then using that blue to add a little bit more form to the top of the wing. And also to add a little bit more texture to some of those feathers that are small, but they're bigger than the feathers on like the main like breast area of the body. So they're a little bit more defined than those really soft feathers on the breast, but they're not as big and bold and distinguished as the larger feathers of the wing or tail. And now I want to add just a little bit of form to the beak. So I'm using a very light dry brush with that blue here. And then again, using some of that nice cool red. It's not a pure red, it does have a little bit of blue in it, but just kind of using that to feather out the crest on her head. And then I've added more of that cool red here, blotting it off onto my paper towel, and I'll do the same on the male. Just add a little bit more of that bright, bold color to add texture to the crest and to his head. And on him, all I really need to do at this point is just to look for areas that need to be maybe a little bit brighter and bolder in terms of how brilliantly red those areas are. We don't want every part of him to be a bright and bold red because that would kind of just wash him out. So we do want to be very deliberate and specific about the areas on him that should be the brightest. And in general, you know, I think that this male bird is a lot less effort. I haven't had to concentrate on him so much because he is just so red. There's not a lot of nuance to him like there is in the female bird. And then I noticed in my photo reference just how red his beak is. So I'm just adding a little bit more red to his beak, especially up at the top. And I guess it kind of makes sense because his body is so pigmented, so I suppose his beak should be too. And then her beak is a lot lighter, and again, you know, just a little bit more subtle. Going back into his leg, I'm just kind of using that same kind of neutral, cool color that I already had on my palette just to kind of fill in the legs a little bit more without adding any kind of, you know, overwhelming color to them. And then I'm just going to clean off this brush, get a little bit more of that pure blue, neutralize it a little bit with another mix, and I'm finally going to start working on this branch that they're both sitting on. Now for this branch, I'm mainly just going to focus on having a good sense of texture and form, but I definitely am not going to focus much on this. I'm not going to, you know, I don't feel any need to make this look overly realistic because it is just kind of, it's almost like a prop in the overall composition. I'm not doing any kind of background, so it's not like this is going to be this overall like realistic scene. The focus is really just the birds. But it's nice to give them just a little bit of a simple context to exist on. So I'm using this nice kind of neutral violet color to dry brush some basic texture onto the branch. And now I'm adding a little bit of my warm yellow into that neutral violet, and I will just kind of start dry brushing this on top just to complement that violet color and to warm up this branch. And kind of, I'm not, you know, making sure to cover all of the white that I left, but a lot of it. But mostly I'm just kind of glazing that on top of the dry brush of the neutral violet. Now I'm going in with a lot more of my cool blue, putting that into my red mix, and then adding my warm yellow to tone it down. My dogs are snoring in the background. And now I'm going to use this neutral color that's a little bit stronger, it's a little more pigmented, to add just a little bit of form to the branch. So basically just around the edges, and in a few select areas, I'll add just a little bit more contrast. And then right here underneath that bird. And really for this entire branch, I'm just doing dry brush on top of dry brush. So the colors that I'm going on top of are fairly dry for the most part. They're pretty much going to dry instantly just because I don't have much water on my brush. And I think that this is actually looking pretty good as far as the branch goes. I don't really want to overdo that. All right, so I have been using the same brush really for this entire painting. This is the first time that I'm switching to a smaller brush. The thing that I really like about round brushes is that they're very versatile. You can use them to cover large areas, and you can also use them, you know, if you just use the point at the tip, you really can do a lot of detail work even with a larger brush. But to do the eyes, I wanted to have even more control, so I switched over to a smaller round brush. And the first thing I'm doing with the eyes is I just went over them with a little bit of that cool blue. The cool blue is basically going to be the color of the reflection in their eyes. A lot of times I think people look at the reflection in an eye and they think it's white, but it almost never is. The only time I would think that it would be white is if you're taking a picture of someone and you're using a flash. But really the light that's reflecting on the eyes of these birds is going to be the sky. So we just need kind of a light blue. And then I'll go over that with a darker color to make the eyes look a little bit more black. Now I'm using this blue, and this is the first time that I've mixed in my Hematite Genuine. That's this Daniel Smith color that looks very gray. Technically it's brown, but I really like to use it to create black. And my favorite way to create black is to use this Hematite Genuine, and I mix it in with my cool blue, so my ultramarine blue, and I get a really nice rich black. I actually don't have a tube of black watercolor paint because I really like to just mix it. I think it looks a little bit more natural. And now I'm going to use that same black in the wing of the male bird's feathers, or the feathers of the male bird's wings, sorry, just to add a little bit more definition. I definitely am going to be careful anytime I'm applying a color as strong as this, and I'm going to use it the very, very least amount necessary. And then I'm going back in around his eye just with a little bit of dry brush and very short strokes. Again, I know it's really difficult to see from this vantage point, but I am allowing some of the lighter colors underneath to show through. I'm really just using this to add texture and depth. And now I'm going into his eye. I'd say that this is the part of the painting that I need to be the most careful because I just want to maintain that little tiny glint of reflection. And then you will also notice in the photo reference that these birds have just a very slight ring around their eye. And so I do want to try to maintain that as much as I can as well, because otherwise you wouldn't even really see his eye because it would basically be just as dark in value as the dark feathers around his eye. And then same on the female, I just want to apply this dark color to her eye, but I want to maintain that little bit of reflection in her eye. And pretty soon I'm going to just kind of shift around my my pad of paper here, this watercolor block, so I can see a little bit better. From the angle that I'm painting at with the video camera going, it's not really how I would typically paint a lot of these details. I would, you know, want my nose up against the paper, trying to kind of get out of that habit. But it's just a little bit different. And also I would typically work on a more angled surface. This is just flat on my desk, which makes it a little bit hard to see. Because if I really wanted to get up close and be able to see these paintings, you would just see the back of my head. And I made a lot of videos of the back of my head before I kind of got the hang of painting a little bit more from a distance. Okay, and then the area around her eye isn't as black as the area around the male bird's eye, but there is still some kind of dark definition around her eye. So I'm using that dark color around her eye in a very subtle way. So it's just dry brushing, but I'm just being very, very reserved in where I apply that. And then I want to add just a little bit of definition right under her beak. And then here where her wing kind of meets her body. And there's just a very subtle striation of feathers right here. I don't want to overdo that, so just a very light touch with very little pigment on my brush will do the trick. And same here with these tail feathers. And you can see the motion of my hand, how short those dry brush strokes are to kind of create that subtle texture. And now I want to add just a little bit more definition to the legs and the underbelly of the male bird. And this mix of paint that's on my palette, it basically has no water in it at this point, so any pigment that I pick up is going to be fairly dry anyway. So I'm mixing another red here, but I'm realizing that I actually want more of a bright red. So I'm going to kind of shift things around a little bit so that I have a little bit more bright red in just a little bit. First, I'm being a little bit more finicky about his feathers around his eye. And then I noticed a little bit of definition here on his head that I didn't even mark in before. Sometimes you just overlook things a little bit, but no worries because I can just very subtly and gently add a little bit of definition with this darker color. And then I'm filling in that little bit of crust on his head. Okay, so here is where I'm realizing that this red is just a little bit too polluted for my purposes. And I cleaned out my brush completely so there wouldn't be any pigment in it. And I flipped around my mixing palette so I'd have a good space to mix some really, really bright reds. So I'm going in with my warm red and my cool red. And I want lots and lots of pigment here, because this is where I'm going to be looking for areas on the male bird that are very, very bright. So I'm going to go in really, really bold. Again, these are just dry brush strokes, but I have a lot of just pure red pigment, so I can really bring that out. And because it's so bright, I want to be pretty careful not to just kind of go over the entire bird and then I lose all of that nuance and build-up that I've been working toward this whole time. So I think that I will just leave that there. And now I just want to add a few final touches to this branch. So I'm going to reactivate this really dark color here. Add a little bit of my cool blue to it. And I'm just going to look for areas that I want to add a little bit more definition and form to. So just kind of around the edges of the branch. A little bit of the texture. And then once I get that in, I will be finished with this branch. So I'm kind of adding a little bit of shadow underneath her. And also just adding a little more definition to the legs if I think that that is needed. My dogs are really snoozing here. Like I've said, they're either sleeping and snoring or they are wrestling with each other and barking, so I'm sure it just sounds kind of funny though, hearing a random snore in the background of a video. Okay, so now I've tilted up my entire pad of paper just so I can get a really good look. This, I guess, is a better alternative to just seeing the back of my head on camera. But I'm just kind of really paying attention to the eyes and making sure that, first of all, that there's a really nice defined round shape to the eyes and that I don't have like a bunch of jagged edges because I couldn't really see what I was doing. And then also trying to make sure you can kind of see that there is a little bit of glint in their eyes. So I want to make sure that I maintain that. And then I'm just kind of looking for anything else in that area that needs to be refined just a little bit. But really, this painting is done at this point. I just tend to be a little bit finicky. And I'm just looking for little things that I can do so I don't have to stop painting, basically. I think, you know, sometimes it's hard to actually sit down to do a painting, but I usually find that it's hard for me to sit down to do a painting because I know there's a good chance that I will not get back up even if I really need to do some other things. So I try to do everything else before I start painting, but you know, this is what I really enjoy. And again, for me, it's like kind of, you know, putting together a puzzle, and I think that that's actually a really good way to spend free time as well. I think anything that kind of just engages your mind and you get to do a little bit of problem solving is a good way to spend your time. So I'm going in with just a little bit of yellow in some of these areas that I think needed a little bit more warmth and vibrance, but they were very, you know, just kind of neutral before. I don't want to overdo it with the yellow. This really should just be a very subtle effect. And then I can mix in this hematite genuine into the yellow just to kind of neutralize it a little bit and work on some of those shadow areas. And then I'm getting more of that cool red right here. I think just to add a little bit more vibrance to the tail. And I noticed in my photo reference at the very tip of her tail feathers, it's a little bit lighter in value. So I'm going to apply that red to the tail feathers everywhere but just like the tip of that one feather. and then even a little bit more definition to the male bird's tail. Having these darker areas on him really helps the more vibrant reds really shine, because you just really need to have that contrast. If you want something to really show and be bold and vibrant, then everything around it kind of has to complement that, meaning that it almost needs to be the opposite. All right, so that is it for this painting. I'm just gonna clean up my palette here, and then I will give you another close-up look so you can kind of see how all of these really small actions that we've taken throughout this painting have accumulated to create a really nice, natural, and realistic effect. And this process, I think, really, it just, it has to be something that you just relax into, because it should be enjoyable. It's kind of like a problem-solving exercise. So you can see how all of these very, very small things are working together to create a very natural, realistic look. And I really encourage you to try doing this, even if it kind of seems intimidating at first glance. As I said, it's just a lot of small things that you do, and they really add up. So I hope that you enjoyed this demonstration. I know this was a little bit different from the rest of my winter art series, but I think this will be the only realistic one I do in this series. I do hope that you enjoyed it, and I hope that you're having a wonderful day, and thank you so much for watching as always. Bye!